Thanks.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon and welcome to WRI-India's webinar, Low Carbon Growth in India, Drivers and Trade-offs. My name is Varun and I'm part of climate program at WRI-India. While we wait for others to join in, I'll just quickly read out some general instructions and take you through the agenda for today's event. The webinar today will be recorded and it will be shared with registered participants. Attendees will remain in listen-only mode, but you can use the Q&A pane to type in your questions or any comments that you have during the webinar, and we'll have a session at the end to discuss some of these questions. In terms of the agenda for the day, we'll begin with opening remarks from Ulka Kelkar, who's the director of the climate program at WRI India, to set the context for today's discussion. Then my colleague Deepthi Swami and I will take you through the key findings from our recent paper that looks at the economic and policy implications of a long-term decarbonization pathway for India using the Energy Policy Simulator, which is an open source systems dynamics model. And we'll follow this up with brief reflections from experts on themes that are central to India's low carbon transition. So beginning with planning a coal phase down, the considerations and potential pathways. Dr. Ashok Srinivas, Senior Fellow, Prayas Energy Group, will be speaking about that. Scale up of green hydrogen in industry and transport. What are the opportunities and challenges in this context? Amrit Singh Deo, Senior Managing Director, FTI Consulting, and an expert with the India Hydrogen Alliance, will be speaking on this. How to finance public expenditure in the low carbon transition. What's the role of carbon pricing and energy taxation in the clean energy transition? Dr. Kavita Rao, Professor, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, will be speaking on this. And then how we can plan for this low carbon transition to also be a just transition in terms of being prepared for the distributional impacts on jobs. Sabina Devan, President and Executive Director, Just Jobs Network, and Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, will be speaking on that. We'll then have a short Q&A and discussion session, and then close the session. So without any further ado, I think I'll hand over the floor to Ulka for the opening remarks. Over to you, Ulka.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar. We are very grateful to have the panelists in particular representing their own sectors of expertise and different disciplinary backgrounds. But really a big thanks to all the participants who joined us today. After India's announcements at the Climate Summit in Glasgow, the conversation in the climate space has very quickly turned from one about targets to one about action. How exactly do we achieve these 2030 and 2070 targets? What needs to happen in different sectors? What technologies do we need to start investing in now so that they can get scaled up and become more affordable in a few decades? What policies do we need in place? Do we need new taxes? And how will this affect the consumers of energy, including the low-income groups for whom energy expenditure can be a substantial portion of their total cost of living? What does it mean for manufacturing domestically in our economy and jobs that can be created? So the goal of all of these climate discussions that are happening is no longer limited to just an environmental sphere. It's becoming something that is extended to every aspect of the economy, both on the production side and on the consumption side. That's the kind of discussion that we want to get into today, going beyond energy towards issues of deep decarbonization in the industry sector, talking about aspects of a just transition, including jobs, as well as cost of living. The discussion today, the main technical presentation today is grounded in work that WRI-India has been doing along with energy innovation and a host of other experts for almost 5 years now, building this completely open source systems dynamics model called the Energy Policy Simulator for India. And really our aspiration is that young researchers, students, anybody should feel free to explore this web interface. We will be sharing the links in the chat box and create your own scenarios. If you care more about the health impacts in the short term, look at which are the most impactful policy levers. If you care more about decarbonization in the long term, look at which policy levers get you there. If you care more about what kinds of taxes need to offset the loss of revenue that might occur as India embarks on this low carbon transition, play around with the revenue levers. This is really one of the, I think, a rare model that lets the user explore various aspects around environment, climate, health, water, jobs, GDP, as well as revenue. So we really hope to introduce this model through this presentation today. And we really look forward to the very fundamental complementary aspects that will be brought out by our panelists today, from technology, from jobs, the finance sector, public finance sector, as well as tricky issues like the phase out of coal and other fossil fuels. So with those opening remarks, let me hand over to my colleagues Deepthi and Varun, who will talk you through the technical presentation. Thanks.
Ulka, and thanks to everybody who has joined us today. So let me dive straight into the presentation. So in this presentation, we hope we will be presenting to you the findings from our working paper, which has been recently published, along with energy innovation.
There is some distortion with your mic. I request everyone to
Is it better now?
Everyone else to turn their mics off. You can just try one more time. It was clear earlier.
Yeah. Is it better now?
No, it isn't. It's just distorted.
Can you hear me now?
Ulka, you are mute.
Go ahead, Deepthi.
Yeah. Am I audible? No. I'm not sure what the issue is because it was working fine in the trial run.
That's right. Yeah. Varun, I don't know if you can just take over for a few minutes. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, Deepthi, if you want to just try to rejoin, I can start.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Sure. So we just then begin by taking you through some of the key findings from our recently published paper, which uses this model that Ulka was talking about, the Energy Policy Simulator, to explore two low carbon development pathways for India. Before discussing the pathways themselves, let me just tell you a little bit about the model. As Ulka said, this is a free and open source systems dynamics model that's been adapted for India in partnership with WRI-India. This allows users to create climate policy scenarios through 2050 in an interactive web interface. It's an economy-wide model that covers the electricity, industry, transport, and building sector. And in terms of some of the key assumptions of the model, falling technology costs are assumed.
I'm back. Am I audible now, Ulka?
Absolutely.
Yes. Go ahead,
okay,
you can take over.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so just to give a brief introduction to the model. So the EPS is a open source system dynamics model, which is available at this link, which is mentioned here. It's an economy-wide model that covers electricity, industry, and transport and building sector. So essentially, the aim of the model is to allow the users to create, to choose between a wide range of policies that are available for decarbonization in the economy. It is possible to assess the impacts of these policy choices through a range of outputs, which are basically to do with emissions, costs, energy, and also in terms of co-benefits in terms of avoided mortality, as well as some other impacts on the economy, which can be measured in terms of the jobs and the GDP impacts. So it has a fully integrated input-output module, which feeds back the choices, the impacts of the clean energy policy or the energy efficiency policy choices in terms of its impact on the GDP in the economy and economic activity. So for more details on the underlying assumptions in the model and the data variables that are used, you can refer to these publications which are linked here, which is the technical note, which since the first launch of the model, and the updated one, as well as the working paper, which we are currently referring to now. So next slide, please, Varun. Yeah, so in terms of the approach of the analysis, what we used is like a what-if analysis, which enables exploration of alternate policy choices. So the model is a forward simulating tool, which allows users to try different policy choices and look at the impacts and implications. So in that sense, it's not a model which is based on an input of a target, of a predetermined target, for which it provides an optimal solution. So in order to create our our decarbonization scenarios, we've essentially made a wide range of assumptions on the policy choices, which we have consulted with various sectoral experts over the course of the study. The data is represented at a national level, so it's not a state, it doesn't look at regional disaggregation or geographical spatial disaggregation. It's at annual timescales. And some of the limitations also include that this is an aggregate model which looks at total economy effects and does not have any breakdown in terms of the distributional impacts across various sections of society. And although we have some fuel elasticity variables which look at how fuel prices impact consumption, it is not, the model is not looking at behavioral responses like rebound effect to some of these policies. And as is with several macroeconomic impact estimations that are out there, it relies on a static input-output table relationship from historical 2015 data, and going forward assumes the same relationships, same industrial classifications to exist over the course of the model run. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is a quick summary of the scenarios, which when you go to the model interface, these are the 3 default scenarios that you will see. And this is what is reflected, this is what is discussed in further detail in the working paper. But essentially, we have the reference scenario, which looks at current ongoing efforts in renewable energy, energy efficiency and electric mobility in terms of the subsidies for electric vehicles, the FAME 2 subsidies. And on the supply side, the model within the power sector and the transport sector uses a cost optimization logic. So it builds the technologies based on what are the most cost competitive options, subject to any additional constraints that we may choose to impose on it. And the NDC, so we looked at 2 scenarios broadly. One was the NDC SDG scenario, which looks at what are the existing linkages between India's NDCs and the SDGs, and leverage those linkages to choose the policies within the EPS to design the scenario. And the ambition that we have set for this scenario is more of a medium-term 2030 ambition, and it is more conservative in the sense of being, in tune with how things are happening on the ground and not as ambitious. So it can be thought of as like a medium ambition scenario. And in a more long-term decarbonization scenario, we look at, we essentially focus on policies which have high mitigation potential and set those policies to reach an ambitious level based on what is the potential that is that can be achieved from that technically through various literature and independent assessments. And we see that policies with proven technologies like energy efficiency, clean electricity are phased in linearly immediately, beginning from 2020 itself. And those relying on nascent technologies like hydrogen are phased in at a later stage from the middle of 2025 or even 2030 in the case of hydrogen demand in industries. Yeah. Next slide, please. Right. So this slide basically summarizes the key policy settings, which so within this, and one other thing that I wanted to mention, that in the long-term decarbonization scenario, which was constructed in through 2020 and 21, was a pre-COP exercise. But after the announcements in COP26, what we have done is revisit some of the assumptions on phasing down coal, as well as looked at the developments for electric vehicles. And these two policies have been changed and modified slightly to enable the long-term decarbonization pathway to be consistent with the commitments that were most recently made in COP, and also an extrapolated trend, while the model only models till 2050, an extrapolated trend from the LTD scenario would essentially be broadly aligned with a net zero 2070 pathway, assuming we don't have any carbon capture technologies in place without carbon capture. So in this presentation, we'll be covering the results of this modified scenario as in the interest of time and relevance. So the policy settings are basically, these particular policies are the ones that have the most impact in terms of emission abatement, and the model also, the scenario also has additional policies, but I will focus on these. These policies achieve more than 2/3 of the emissions abatement in 2050. Some of these policies are phased in starting in 2020 itself, linearly till 2050. So in 2050, on the right-hand column, you will see like the target ambition for these policies, and how, for example, the electric vehicle sales mandate is, it's more ambitious on certain vehicle segments depending on the feasibility and the current progress. And there's also material efficiency in terms of reducing demand from materials like cement and iron and steel through more efficient processes and energy efficient construction material. We also have a percentage of carbon-free electricity generation being mandated, which is essentially fossil-free sources, which acts as a minimum mandate for the model. But what happens in the model is there is, due to the cost optimization logic in the power sector, there is endogenous learning, which makes it cheaper to build more wind and solar as there is more economies of scale, as more capacity is deployed in the model over the time frame between 20 and 2050. So what it ends up often overshooting that minimum mandate that we set up due to the increasing cost competitiveness of variable RE especially. And then we also do an early retirement of otherwise non-retiring coal capacity, starting at a slow pace now, but reaching about 6 gigawatt per year in 2050. And we have electrification and hydrogen substitution of fossil fuels in the industry and use emissions, as well as production of this electricity through clean electricity supported by policies like the carbon-free electricity generation. Next slide, please. So, so the broad rationale for guiding the policy settings is essentially looking at what is the relevance for public policies and targets. So we don't consider CCS in the absence of any studies which look at any near-term cost feasibility in terms of costs, and Also, technologies like hydrogen are phased in more at a later time scale. And we're also supporting, complementarity between policies. So essentially creating demand for more electricity through industry and transport, and at the same time making that generation of that electricity clean through clean electricity mandates. And some of the policies have trade-off in terms of economic activity. For example, the material efficiency policy which we implement depresses industrial output. So it directly translates to lesser production of those materials, and which in turn impacts the economic activity and GDP. So what we do is which we'll cover in the later slides, is try and introduce a carbon tax to mitigate that, or even in terms of different ways of recycling the revenues from the carbon tax. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the emissions reduced with respect to the reference scenario in cumulative terms. And here you will see that in the short term, most of the benefits are coming from efficiency policies, both in terms of demand and fuel and material, material demand and fuel efficiency, as well as, but in the long run, a lot of the emissions reduction happens in terms of reductions in due to policies like the carbon tax and substitution of fossil fuels with electricity and hydrogen in both industry as well as transport. Next slide. Right. So the total emissions reductions in annual terms, when translated in annual terms, we see that in this long-term decarbonization scenario, we can reduce almost 2/3 of the emissions by 2050. And in the near term, if we take a look at 2030, it's about 1/3 of emissions reductions in both GHG and CO2 emissions. There is a peaking which we observe based on our policy choices of around 2035, after which emissions continue to decline. As we see, there is no plateauing of emissions in the reference scenario. So looking at some of the sectors, so there is reductions observed in, these are the main most emissions intensive sectors that we focused on in the economy. The power sector emissions reduced by almost 85% by 2050. It's almost fully clean. Industry emissions reduce a little lesser by 67%. Most of the industrial emissions in the BAU grow from cement and iron and steel, and most of the energy efficiency and fuel switching measures essentially reduce the growth from this iron and steel and cement sectors. While in the beginning of the model run, there is more energy. Most of the emissions in the industry sector are comprised of energy emissions, and then there is only about 1/3 of process emissions. But as we go, we reach by 2050 up to 75% of the energy emissions are reduced. But process emissions being harder to abate, we see that in 2050 it's almost an even split between energy and process emissions. In transport emissions, much of the growth in the reference case comes from fossil fuel demand in the heavy duty freight segment, which acts as like the biggest opportunity for mitigation. And there's almost there is a significant reduction coming from the freight segment in transport emissions. Next slide, please. Yeah, so looking at the split of the electricity mix, when we saw the emissions reduction for the electricity sector, it essentially translates to this type of a mix where much of it So we do reach levels of fossil-free electricity capacity as a share of total up to 85 to 90% in 2050, and that is guided by several policies like the early retirement. That is driven by several policies like the early retirement of coal, the carbon-free electricity standard, which leads to more adoption of clean electricity in the power sector, and also through the carbon tax, which acts on this particular sector. So going forward, there is a coal phase down being gradually based on cost considerations and the other policies that I mentioned. Most of the coal is phased out starting from 2050, and we see that in 2050, most of the renewable energy capacity comes from variable sources of wind and solar, which essentially means that there is a significant increase and in the need for grid battery storage within the model. Yeah. Next slide, please. So in terms of industrial fuel use, there is a reduction in fuel usage in industry between reference and the long-term decarbonization scenario because of the efficiency and the material, both the material efficiency and the industrial end-use energy efficiency policies, and also the switch to more efficient fuels like electricity. So there is the increasing coal consumption is gradually shifting to a more distributed mix, but we still see some coal being used in the final energy mix in 2050. Slide. Okay. So in terms of transport fuel use, so as we can see in the reference case, there is increasing fossil fuels mainly from petroleum and diesel, increasing fuel demand in the transport sector. But due to policies like mode shifting and switching to electricity, which is more efficient, energy efficient, we have we have almost 50% reduction in energy use. But we still see that there is some share of petroleum fuels coming from the heavy vehicle freight segment, which is not entirely electrified or substituted with hydrogen. There is only a small segment that we have taken to be able to be substituted by hydrogen in the transport sector. So in the long-term decarbonization scenario, what is essentially happening is that we are at least able to keep it to the BAU levels of fossil fuel consumption without it rising to nearly twice as much. Thanks. Next slide, please. Right. So, where do these choices bring us in terms of our COP26 commitments, right? So, if we look at the reference scenario itself, because there is market-driven logic in the power sector and the transport sector, we see that market forces alone can lead to increased adoption of renewable energy and electrification in the power sector and transport sectors respectively. So the reference scenario is essentially quite optimistic in that sense. It's not a do-nothing scenario which assumes that past trends would continue. But at the same time, having said that, we do have to, if we look at where we are currently, then we have to almost triple the amount of clean electricity, non-fossil electricity capacity in the mix. So this is in terms of the interpretation of the targets which are listed here. Yeah. So now we'll go over the economic outcomes and the co-benefits of the scenario, which I'll request my colleague Varun to take over now.
Thanks, Deepti. Thanks. I'll just take the next 10 minutes or so to speak about some of the wider implications of the low carbon transition on the economy and society, and some of the choices and trade-offs that may come up in this context. Just beginning very quickly with the co-benefits, I mean, some of the Other benefits that we can expect from decarbonization is improved air quality, because burning fossil fuels doesn't only emit greenhouse gases, but also emits pollutants which are harmful to human health, like particulate matter. So what we see in terms of particulate matter emissions, for example, is that they reduce by almost 50% by 2050 in the long-term decarbonization pathway as compared to the reference pathway. And the improvement in air quality can potentially reduce up to 8.2 million premature deaths from the present through 2050. The chart on the right illustrates potential water savings from the transition away from coal in the power sector, which could save up to 41 trillion liters of water between the present and 2050. This is because coal is also one of the most water-intensive electricity generation technologies, consuming, for example, on average 30 times the amount of water per unit of electricity generated as compared to solar PV. Now, in terms of the capital investments required, the decarbonization pathway does rely on the use of several technologies. For example, renewable energy technologies, battery storage for electric vehicles and the electricity grid, and hydrogen electrolyzers for green hydrogen production. Battery storage and hydrogen technologies are still nascent and expensive. Even factoring in the projected technology costs over time, making this low carbon transition will require additional investments compared to the reference case. And these investments could amount up to $30 billion or 0.5% of GDP in 2030, and $350 billion or almost 3% of GDP in 2050. The chart on the right depicts potential savings from the reduction in the use of fossil fuels and operations and maintenance costs across the economy. This is the result of both efficiency policies, which reduce the total demand for energy in the economy, as well as fuel switching policies that substitute the demand for expensive fossil fuels like petroleum by green alternatives. And we see that these potential savings could actually exceed the additional capital expenditure required within this decade. Another critical implication of the transition away from fossil fuels is the implication for government tax revenue. Tax collections from fossil fuels, which is primarily presently from taxes on petroleum products, comprises close to 25% of the central government tax revenue. And we find that the fall in the fossil fuel tax collections could amount to almost 2% of the GDP in 2050. Therefore, a critical question that comes up is, how do we find alternate sources for revenue mobilization for the government? This is because government expenditure on things like education, social welfare schemes, and so on has a multiplier effect and makes a key contribution to GDP and employment. What we do in our long-term decarbonization scenario is that we employ a carbon tax, which is increased in a phased manner over time, reaching approximately 5,000 rupees or $75 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent of emissions in 2050. And we see that this can potentially compensate for the, more than compensate for the loss in government revenue from petroleum taxes. Taxing emissions as opposed to petroleum products provides a relatively wider tax base by including emissions from all fossil fuels, as well as emissions from non-energy sources such as industrial process emissions. As well as the phased increase in the tax rate helps compensate for the decline in the fossil fuel use in the economy over time. So just to, I'll reiterate the point here. The carbon tax may be one potential mechanism to offset this loss in revenue, but the central question still remains that how do we offset this loss in government revenue from incumbent energy taxes? And this could also include other alternatives, for instance, higher rates of income taxes or corporate taxes, taxes on alternative fuels like electricity or hydrogen, which substitute fossil fuels in this transition, or increased reliance on deficit financing. And making the right choice will require evaluation of these alternatives with respect to multiple considerations, such as distributional impacts, political feasibility, and so on. And this is a question that we'll come back to in the thematic reflections following this presentation. In terms of employment, we find that compared to the reference case, up to 40 million additional jobs could be created in the decarbonization pathway. These consider the effect of direct, indirect, and induced impacts. So direct impacts refer to impacts that occur in sectors directly impacted by the policies that we choose. For example, the impact of a carbon-free electricity standard on the electricity sector. Indirect impacts refer to impacts in sectors that have an economic relationship to the directly affected sectors. So for example, in the case of the electricity sector, coal mining would be a sector that would be indirectly affected due to the reduction in thermal power capacity. Induced impacts refer to those impacts that occur due to respending of the changes in income resulting from direct and indirect impacts. Now, what we see in our scenario is that the majority of the new jobs created will be by induced effects. And the sectors that will mainly benefit from induced jobs are agriculture, sectors like agriculture, retail and trade, education. Direct and indirect jobs in clean energy, manufacturing and construction also show increases, but of a smaller magnitude. And jobs in other sectors like mining and fossil fuel fall. Similar to employment, the transition on an aggregate also shows a positive impact on the GDP, which could be up to 3% higher compared to the reference case in 2050. And this is driven by new green investments, along with the respending of fuel savings and the carbon tax revenue by the government that create multiplier effects in the economy. Just before I end, I'd like to illustrate the forward-looking or the what-if nature of the analysis by taking an example of the coal retirement policy. As Deepti explained earlier, we assume a linearly increasing annual retirement mandate that starts with 300 megawatt per year in 2027 and reaches 6 gigawatt per year by 2050, which results in a complete phase out of coal from the power sector by the early 2050s. A faster alternative could be retiring coal completely by, say, the early 2040s, which would require something like a 7 gigawatt per year annual retirement mandate starting now. And both reach approximately the same emissions in 2050, but the pathways to reach the 2 points are different. And as you can see, the faster coal phase-out pathway can cumulatively avoid nearly 7 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions in the intermediate years in reaching that level of emissions in 2050. And just following from some of the benefits that we spoke about earlier, of course, a faster retirement does mean more water saved and more lives saved, but it may not be a simple choice because it could also involve other trade-offs. For instance, what we find in the model is that a faster coal phase out could mean more than double the requirement of natural gas peaker plants for grid flexibility to balance the integration of variable renewable energy before battery costs fall sufficiently and make that cost competitive. Right? This could potentially, for example, increase reliance on gas imports and create the risk of stranded assets. Another consideration that could be relevant would be additional jobs lost, for instance, where we see that 500,000 coal mining jobs, more coal mining jobs could be lost by 2050 in a faster coal phase-out pathway, which could be especially a concern, say, for regions which are heavily dependent on coal-based employment. So what I just wanted to illustrate through that example was the fact that there's no unique or optimal pathway necessarily to reach the same point of emissions in the future. And these alternative pathways may be not, there may not be a simple choice in terms of the various alternatives, and they may require making normative choices and trade-offs. Just to summarize, I think some of the key messages that come from this analysis are that the long-term decarbonization pathway does yield improved air quality, health, lower water use, and potentially aggregate outcomes that are better than the reference scenario. This has to be supported by decisive policy mandates for electrification, green hydrogen use, for example, in the industry and transport sector, as Deepti said. The role of supporting infrastructure, battery storage, EV charging stations, hydrogen supply and distribution network will be critical to actually make this shift happen. The government revenues from fossil fuel taxes, it's possible to offset these losses through mechanisms like a phased carbon tax. There could be alternatives which would have to be evaluated. And then while this transition would create economic gains, or is likely to create economic gains at an aggregate level, what we don't see is how these effects would be distributed across regions, across different income groups, or across gender, for instance. And it's very important for us to understand this better and make sure that the distribution of these aggregate gains happens in an equitable and a fair manner. That is a question that is outside our modeling framework, but is a very important question that and is one of the central questions to this decarbonization pathway. And the last point is just what I just illustrated through the coal analysis, that there are alternative pathways that would be possible, and they will require making normative choices and trade-offs. So with that, I think I'll just conclude our presentation, and I think we can move straight to the thematic reflections from experts. And
thanks, Varun. Thanks a lot.
I'll
request all the panelists to turn on their videos and we can stop sharing our screen. I think for me, the three big takeaways from this presentation really are that we need to make our assumptions very explicit. And that is what we believe the EPS really helps us do. On the left-hand side of the web interface, you have a drop-down list with all the policy levers. And you, the user, can choose what your assumptions are. As far as a couple of built-in examples that are there, you can see them explicitly. The second is that everything is linked. It is not just about reducing carbons in the power sector. There are repercussions on the industry sector, on the transport sector, and really the larger economy as a whole. And this model lets you look at those linkages, at least in the same consistent platform. The third is that policy levers can be double-edged swords, the kinds of trade-offs that Varun spoke about. So you could have a faster phase out of coal, which leads to a more aggressive loss of jobs, but you have savings on the health side. You could have this very powerful material efficiency lever in industry, things like circular economy, bringing in hydrogen, all of that. Very powerful decarbonization lever. But just because currently the way we measure GDP measures stuff, it measures production. If you produce less stuff, then by our current definitions, our current metrics, you could have a negative effect on GDP that needs to be planned for an offset. Third, you could have a carbon tax, again, very powerful policy lever, puts revenue in the hands of government, but it could have an effect on the cost of energy and cost of living of the low-income groups in society. So in the spirit of this exploration and recognizing that there is no one size fits all, there is no one ideal set of policy levers to go with, let's just throw this open for discussion. We'll request all the panelists to make opening remarks of about 5 minutes. Ashok, we'll start with you, Dr. Ashok Srinivas with the Prayas Energy Group. If you could give your opening remarks, what's on your wish list? What are your predictions for what needs to happen in the power sector as we try to phase down fossil fuels and scale up renewable energy? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ulka. Thanks for having me on this discussion. And before I jump into the coal phase down, which is kind of the topic that you asked me to dwell a little more on, I'd like to spend a minute generally with a couple of other reflections on what I heard. Firstly, I think I'm glad you've undertaken this exercise, and it's a transparent open source model, and that I think is a very good thing. That's exactly the kind of thing we've been trying to do at Prayas too, with a few other open source models, and we should see how these models can start talking to each other to make the analysis even richer. But a couple of comments that I had was, actually one specific thing on, I'm very glad that you actually included this whole aspect of revenues from energy sector and the impact on tax revenues, because we had, as you probably know, we did a working paper on this last year and had a panel discussion Switzerland, where Kavita was one of our panelists when we discussed this last year. So we think it's a very important issue and a neglected issue and I'm glad more and more of us are bringing this into the discussion. One comment I had about that was actually maybe a couple of comments. One is, I think as Varun towards the end did say, one doesn't necessarily need to look at the energy sector as a net zero or a zero sum taxation game. One, if you're losing taxes from the energy sector, one can think of the larger economy as a source of tax revenue. It doesn't have to come from the energy sector through a carbon tax or whatever, particularly because I believe that India already has among the highest energy prices in the world. If you look at the consumption point, what we are paying for energy, we're already among the highest in the world, and taxing that any further, whether you call it a carbon tax or whatever tax, will only make the economy more uncompetitive. Industry will become uncompetitive, and people will find energy harder to access. So something to think about. But as you said, rightly said, it's not an easy problem. I mean, it's a very hard problem, and there are no easy solutions. So this is a proposal that you put forward. Just my comment on that. Now diving into the issue of coal phase out, I think we all know that coal is kind of going to get phased out at some pace. The question is, what should that pace be? Who should decide what that is? And how do we, what are the factors to consider when we're doing that? So I just wanted to kind of share with you of some of our thoughts on what are the kinds of issues that one needs to consider when we talk about how should one approach coal phase out. The first and foremost is, of course, the fact that we as a developing economy still have growing energy demand, and we are likely to have a growing energy demand, and electricity, especially electricity demand, will grow even faster with electrification of other sectors. So the first and foremost question is, how are we going to meet this demand should be one of the considerations. As we talk about reducing the coal's capacity and generation, do we have enough alternative capacity, especially at those times of the day when perhaps the intermittent renewables are not going to be available? And this is more relevant in the short term, as I think you also talked about, till about, let's say, late 2020s or 2030, by when we are all hoping that batteries will come and be the magic wand that will solve our problems. But we need to wait and watch. So we need to be a little careful about that. If we can't put all our eggs in the basket that battery prices are going to come down. But so that's something that we need to be a little careful about as to how we are going to meet the energy demand, not only on an aggregate level, but at an instantaneous level because of the nature of electricity being what it is. Then the other thing is, as I said, the unknown about battery costs or storage costs is something that we need to be kind of watchful about, optimistic, but watchful about it. We can't really put all expect that it will necessarily happen as papers published today are saying that it will happen. In fact, as you might have seen, solar prices already this year are probably higher than last year for various reasons, whether it's supply chain disruptions from China or international geopolitics, or maybe technology growth has also kind of plateaued a little bit. One can't expect technology to keep improving forever. So one needs to keep in mind some of these potential, shall we say, speed breakers that one might come across, and accordingly have multiple pathways that one can think about on how to deal with this. And the last thing that I just wanted to say on this aspect is also the fact of the feasibility of the replacement renewable capacity that we're talking about. We all want renewable capacity to come online, but historically, I think the best we have done is about, I think, 18 gigawatts of renewables in one particular year, 2018 or something like that, before the pandemic. Probably a split of 10 solar and 8 wind, or maybe something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers. So with that kind of a capacity, most analyses that I see are talking about needing 40, 50 gigawatts of new renewable capacity coming on stream every year to meet not only the incremental growth in demand, but also to meet for whatever else we are planning to retire. So is that something that's feasible? Is that even possible given especially the current international conditions and where the geopolitical situation is? So I think this is something that, again, a factor that we need to keep in mind about the feasibility of alternatives coming on stream at the pace we want them to come on. And the last thing I wanted to say about the coal thermal capacity phase out is that especially at the time scales that you're talking about, one hopes that most of the capacity would anyway kind of age out by then. even capacity installed by 2010 would be 40 years old in 2050. So definitely ripe for retirement by then. Maybe a little bit of it will remain, but the rest of it, I think one can safely say, can go. The bigger worry that we see that one needs to be careful about is if we tend to get more aggressive about retirement of coal capacity early, there is a potential risk that you might actually end up adding new coal capacity to replace that old coal capacity because you don't have any other alternatives available. And that will then last for another 40 or 50 years, which is something that I don't think we can afford to. So that is a bigger risk, and one needs to be careful in balancing how fast we want to retire coal versus being able to meet energy demand. And the other issue, of course, with coal phase out is the whole issue of just transitions. How do we ensure that employments are provided, communities are protected, and so on? But I think we have people like Sabina who can probably do a much better job on talking about those issues. So I won't talk about them now. We can come back to it later if required. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Ashok. Thank you for those comments. We'll now move to Mr. Amrit Singh Bayer from FTI Consulting and also representing the India Hydrogen Alliance. I believe you have some slides that you'd like to speak to. You have about 5 minutes.
Thanks, Alka. I'll try to do justice to this topic in 5 minutes. But before I do that, compliments to WRI for this study and this report, and for including hydrogen in a meaningful manner. I had a look at the model very quickly, so compliments to the team on that. Now, when we talk about hydrogen, what I'll do is I will share some slides that we worked together with Niti Aayog to talk about the development of the supply chain. But before I do that, why is hydrogen interesting? Hydrogen is interesting not just as a fuel, but also as a storage vector. And that is what makes it a little different than a discussion just as a fuel, which means it can be a complement when we're talking about renewables, battery storage, and electrification as we go forward, whether it's for the transport use case or industrials. The big elephant in the room, the challenge is both two challenges. Both one is technology, high cost of technology, and the high cost of hydrogen production itself and getting it across. The capital costs are incredibly high. So with that, let me just share some of these slides, and then maybe we'll have some time for a quick discussion. Give me a sec. So these are slides we ran, early October. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So again, we took a systems view just as you have done, and while your study talks about 2050. What we have tried to do in this session with the government and industry is to be a little more pragmatic. We have seen some of the numbers, maybe 1% for industrial use by 2030, but how do we even get to 1%? And what are the steps that are required? So equally, we'll need to take a systems view, and this goes beyond just policy measures. It needs to be about collaboration within the private sector, because production and consumption needs to be co-located for hydrogen. Otherwise, the infrastructure costs just shoot up. The cost of transporting hydrogen is probably going to be more expensive than the cost of hydrogen production. And this is a learning that we have taken from the European geographies, where they've had this as an experience. The slight difference is probably Japan and Korea, but they are spending a lot of public money to build that hydrogen infrastructure for transport. Just something to keep in mind. Short-term priorities, as I said, what do we need to do in the next 5 to 10 years to get this off the ground, is to move it from the lab, from R&D pilots to a large commercial size, gigawatt size commercial production. And the fact is we don't even have a single such commercial plant, right? And that's what we need to focus on in the next 5 years, particularly before we start to do a few of these large gigawatt scale, I won't say plants, but clusters. That's again replicating the experience from Europe with hydrogen valleys, as they are calling it. I believe our government has called them hubs, and that's a recommendation we've put in as well. But to put these hubs or clusters, whatever you want to call them, is going to take collaboration, not just amongst different government agencies, but also different players in the value chain, which means everybody first needs to be on the same roadmap on hydrogen commercialization. Yeah. Funding is a big one, and I'll talk a little more specifically. And how do you make this entire value chain interoperable, right? The standards, safety standards, transport, use cases all need to fit in beautifully. This is very, very nascent from an ecosystem development, but let me give you a sense of what we are talking about. If we just look at funding, again, I think I heard the figure of $35 billion. We see the figure somewhere close. Yeah, I know it's a large band between $25 to $45 billion, but this is really what we need to solve for. The good news is the source is visible, though it may not be in India. It might be with the developed markets, but it is part of the discussion on the $100 billion flow from developed markets to emerging markets. India should definitely ask for a dedicated a piece of that to be able to fund something like hydrogen commercialization. Let's just start with production. And this was done, as I said, in late September, early October. And scenario B is what the government has now announced. You'll see a disclaimer right at the bottom, but they have now announced the intention of a 5 million metric ton for green hydrogen by 2030. Now, let's break this down. What does that mean in terms of electrolyzer install capacity? How many large hubs or clusters do we need? How much renewable energy is required, and what sort of investments are we talking about? And there you are. If you focus on the middle box, that's a significant amount of decisions and consensus to be built on the technical side, on the economic modeling side, and on the policy side. All of these you need to get them right. So that gives you a sense of the problem statement ahead just for production. Okay. The next slide will, covering on the transport decisions that need to be taken. Liquid, gas, hybrid, can we afford to take both? Is it expensive? What does it mean? Yeah. Again, similarly, technical, economic, and policy challenges, and they need to be coordinated, right? And then the use cases. I think I have, yes. The use cases. We've had a hydrogen policy for the last 12 years or maybe 15 years, which focused on the transport use case. 2020, we missed most of our targets. And I think, again, this is the learning for us as an ecosystem as a whole. It's an expensive lesson from Europe. But what's good this time around is the industrial use case discussion is very strong. And that's what's different this time around. Just sort of putting it all together, if we really want to build a roadmap and a value chain, these are the sort of numbers we are talking about. If you look at the blue, which is possibly where government has signaled 5 million metric tons, we still have to get all these decision points done and achieved in the next 10 years. So it might seem still a long way off, but it's actually very short from the way we see it. And as an industry, we've created the India Hydrogen Alliance to bring the private sector together with the government and the think tanks. We feel the one big step to get this started is to have gigawatts scale clusters or hubs to start with. They may not be feasible on a standalone basis, which means they will need a national support from the government and consortia to come together, industry to come together to work with different parties. And that's something we've just put in with the government. They have agreed to form the first task force, and that will be announced fairly soon, the constituent. I'll stop there. That's what we are doing to get the ecosystem for hydrogen up and going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this is very timely and absolutely up to date in terms of the big picture about where we are going with hydrogen. Indeed, just a scale of the challenge. Let me now turn to Dr. Kavita Rao. Certainly, we have been, very impressed by the work that Prayas did. And we keep quoting this figure that 25% of the national government's tax revenue currently comes from fossil fuel taxes. The carbon tax that we are talking about, we are proposing to apply it even on process emissions from industry, not just fuel use. But we completely recognize that there are many issues here, including subsidies. So really grateful for your comments on the pitfalls and the way ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in this discussion. It was very educative for me to read your paper as well. What the two things that I was looking for in the paper are what is the role one is assigning to a carbon tax on one hand, and what is it that we are proposing or aiming for vis-a-vis an employment focus. So since you do have somebody talking about employment, I won't spend much time speaking about my thoughts about it, but let me talk a little bit about the taxation and the carbon story. The way our tax structure has evolved over the years and the demands that people are putting forward in reforming the GST system further, there is one consistent line of argument which says that taxes on fossil fuels should be brought in line with all other taxes. It should be made into a GST. And there is another school of thought which says that we should have higher levies on polluting fuels, coal included, which GST doesn't tax very high, to make sure that we dissuade people from using these fuels and encourage a shift towards cleaner fuels. So as I understand it, the three objectives for having a carbon tax from the discussion that I found in the paper are threefold. The first is to find revenue for government to replace other fossil fuel taxes. Since fossil fuel taxes per se you're not proposing to reduce, but you anticipate that there'll be a reduction in the overall rate of growth of demand for fossil fuels, and therefore if you don't increase taxes, the revenues from that sector decline, and that seems to be the challenge. And so we need to find other sources of revenue to aid governments to not be hindered in taking a cleaner decision, given that they have such a lot of revenue locked in with those fuels. So that seems to be one question. The second is, implicitly does change in taxation induce a behavioral response? And on that, I still don't have a very clear answer from the paper on whether a behavioral response was built in or not. So there seems to be statements on both sides. So I'm not very sure whether a behavioral response has been built in, but that is normally what a carbon tax would be used for, because you increase the tax in order to discourage, and that is a behavioral response. So that's the second issue. The third, I think, is to find resources to aid the transition from where we are to where we want to be. And that is the element where I think my thought process was more focused on. My sense was the transition, even in what Mr. Deo was trying to talk about, all of our conversations implicitly assume that there are enough resources available to ensure whatever transition we want to ensure happens. So when I was looking at the paper, I was trying to find what that trade-off is. So what is the challenge to doing your deep decarbonization strategy? And if I can't find the challenge, if I can say, okay, if it's a series of processes that the government needs to deliver by way of a policy document, then transition should be easy. So I think we are, that is the challenge that I feel I was finding in reading the paper, that I would like to know, we would like to do a deep decarbonization, but upfront, this is the challenge we face. So this is what we need to find resources for, because a lot of the discussion on taxation is, one, in the long run, does government have enough money if carbon taxes are reduced? And if they reduce gradually, the government will find resources. So we don't have to struggle with trying to find new levers for the government to struggle with. In the short run, since this is not a long term, can we get governments to be cognizant of the fact that since these are not going to be resources which will stay with you for 40 years, can we use that envelope of resources to do something that aids in the transition? So that is how I was positioning the question for myself. And so it is short-term optimization more than long-term. So can we use the short-term revenues to do a long-term goal? And I'm not sure I got the answer to that. So the question that I had for the authors is, if you knock off carbon tax from your scenarios, then it appears as if GDP declines or GDP declines as compared to the BAU, business as usual scenario, or employment actually is lower. So what seems to be driving the need for carbon tax is the need to generate that employment, which is coming through government expenditure alone. So which means the economy by itself doesn't seem to be generating the employment that we are hoping to generate. And that is a description that we need to be aware of. So yes, I understand the idea of carbon tax. I think by itself a carbon tax is a difficult idea to push through in the long run, because it becomes a smaller and a smaller sector, which doesn't excite people in terms of its taxability. So we have to look for other sources of revenue for the government, and a slow transition away from carbon actually aids that process of exploration. So can we have quick answers on what is an alternative? I would think in the long run, we are looking at higher personal income taxes as a way to becoming a more mature economy. The more we rely only for carbon taxes to fulfill that gap, we will still be stuck in trying to not raise incomes government resources elsewhere. So I think I'll stop with that. But I think, yeah, I would like to see what the challenge of adopting these strategies are. And therefore, does carbon tax help in that transition? That I thought is the primary question to ask. I'm sorry if that fits in with.
Thank you very much. And I think you've set up very nicely for Sabina's comments on jobs. And so Sabina, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ulka. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
okay, wonderful. So of course, thank you to WRI for the invitation to be here today and to be part of this panel with such deep and diverse expertise. Congratulations to the team on the paper, which is based on rigorous research and the EPS, which, as has already been acknowledged, I think is a really valuable tool, and the fact that it's open source really adds to its benefits. So thank you for this work. Just by way of a general comment, I think this paper is a really valuable addition to the discourse on climate change in India. The latest IPCC reports and the media recently has focused much more on India, which is good, because there's little recognition, especially beyond the scientific community abroad, that India is actually ground zero for the effects of climate change, and is absolutely critical to the overall reduction in emissions as well. So I'm not from the fraternity of those working on climate change specifically, but I look at this issue from a very particular perspective of labor market, work, and workers. That's also because my organization, Just Jobs Network, for those of you that may not know us, specifically looks at strategies for employment generation and how different forces, including climate change, are restructuring labor markets. And against that backdrop, how do we create jobs? How do we protect workers and create systems that enable workers and employers, as well as governments and policy, to adapt to these dynamic changes that we're all witnessing right now? So I'd like to make just a couple of points with respect to this report and the broader issue of the effects of climate change and the transition, the energy transition on the world of work. So first, I think the study underscores both the urgency of national climate action as one, and two, the scale of the opportunity to create a low carbon development pathway. And I think that's very interesting, because on the one hand, I think urgency of national climate action really centers on the havoc that the climate crisis will inflict on labor markets and livelihoods, right? So we know that in India and in other countries that are agriculture, that have a large share of the population employed in agriculture, the deleterious effects of climate change could induce massive migration, a loss of livelihoods. And so the kind of urgency of national climate action in one respect really centers on the deleterious effects of climate change on livelihoods. I think the opportunity that the paper speaks to is, among other factors, linked to the potential of job creation of the transition to renewable energy and clean energy and more low carbon growth trajectories. Now, Dr. Rao asked, what are the challenges to decarbonization? And both Dr. Srinivas and Dr. Rao spoke about the jobs as a challenge. But going one level deeper, I think the human effects of the transition extend well beyond jobs lost and jobs created, right? So on the one hand, when we talk about a just transition, we're talking about the impact that climate change is going to have on existing livelihoods and how we need to think about protecting workers against those risks. On the other hand, when we talk about the energy transition, much of the discourse actually focuses on the quantity of jobs. We will lose X jobs in the fossil fuel sector. We will create X jobs through the renewable energy transition, whether it's direct, indirect, or induced. I really like the delineation of those. But the quantity of jobs is not just the only factor that needs consideration, right? A just transition, I would argue, goes well beyond the quantity of jobs to actually speak about the deeper human effects and the impact on not just the quantity, but how do we transition these workers from one sector to another? How do we protect the workers that are going to be affected by climate change? And then this very quickly takes us to a much broader conversation about how various systems, right? Our welfare system, our skills training system, the spatial distribution of workers, where the renewable energy jobs will be and where the fossil fuel jobs currently are, and how do how the portability of benefits, all of that very quickly, and I don't have time to go into all of the details of these things within 5 to 10 minutes, but all of these factors become part and parcel of the conversation on how to truly realize a just transition, right? So the paper talks about a projection that 40 million jobs will be created by 2050. And of course, this is really valuable in serving as an impetus for making the case for decarbonization. I think that's really important. That said, as someone who works on employment, I would consider any projection with regard to how many jobs will be created to be extremely fragile at best, right? We don't even currently have clarity on how many jobs we created last year, let alone how many we'll create in the next in the next 5 years. And so, usually job projections, when tested against reality, tend not to hold, right? That said, I think, so aside from my own reservations about any kind of projections, and the first point that I made, which is the importance of actually looking beyond how many jobs will be created and how many jobs will be lost, to what are the kinds of systems do we need in place to actually effectively protect livelihoods and effectively transition workers out of fossil fuels into clean energy sectors. The third point there is exactly what Dr. Rao raised and then stopped short, because she graciously said that I would bring it up, which I will, which is, a lot of this hinges on sort of the government spending and the multiplier effects of government spending, the revenues generated by a carbon tax. Now, I'm not one to comment on the viability of a carbon tax, not my area, but I'd love to hear more about that from you all. But beyond that, I think the idea that government spending is what's going to create jobs rather than making the investments we need to make to create an economy that is more job generating outside of government expenditure, that's a vibrant private sector that's generating jobs, small, medium enterprises, et cetera. I think that's a fundamental issue. So, again, and just as a sort of part 3B to that is really this idea that, you know, yes, government expenditure creates jobs in general and has multiplier effects, but not all government spending is created equal. So what government ends up spending money on and then the impact that it has on jobs creation is also extremely important. You might get government making all kinds of capital expenditure, expenditures that are capital intensive that then don't generate as many jobs as we need. So really what I'm just trying to do is to just delineate a few things that I think are very important when we try to really address this question of, you know, to what extent is jobs one of the challenges that is, you know, confronting the decarbonization pathway. And I think there the issue is less, at least the discourse is centered on how many jobs will be lost, how many jobs will be gained. But I think it's about time that we move beyond the how many jobs will be gained and how many jobs will be lost to really thinking about what are the systems, the ancillary systems that we need to support the transition, to protect livelihoods, and that so around, you know, around this particular issue, and to rebuild systems we need to manage the human effects of the transition. So, you know, you said in your blog, Varun, decarbonizing India's economy will create a stronger, healthier, and more prosperous society, to which I would just add, if we pay adequate attention to a broader set of systems that support not just job creation, but also the quality of work, you know, the quality of work, looking at informality issues, welfare related issues, skills, and so on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and thanks to all our panelists. There have been a number of specific technical questions in the Q&A box, which the authors will be answering in writing. But I want to take on two questions and pose them to all the panelists in turn, and we can go in the same order in which we went, Ashok, Amrit, Kavita, and Sabina, which is just by way of closing remarks. What, according to you, is the most important policy lever? And you don't have to restrict yourself to what's in the paper, but for decarbonization, what is the most important policy lever that you think needs to be paid attention to? And secondly, drawing on Unnada's question in the Q&A, how do we really, when governments want to know about the costs, like even Dr. Kavita was asking, but what's the challenge, what's the constraint, but how can we point towards the potential opportunities? Or is that something that you even think is important? So let me just go to Ashok with that. Most important policy levers, and do you think we need to shift from a narrative of costs to a narrative of opportunities? And if so, how? Thanks.
Thanks, Ulka. I don't think I'll hazard a guess on the most important policy because we're talking of 2050. I mean, I find it hard to think of like 2 years down the line, I think, because I think there's just too many unknowns to actually talk of definitive good policy options for us to decarbonize in the long term. What I would say is that the approach that we should take is adopt as aggressive an approach as we can in the short term, given the complete knowledge that we have, while we build systems and processes to prepare for the long term, including being nimble enough to adapt to changing situations, because the energy sector is changing so rapidly. I think having any definitive roadmap today, essentially you'll just have to tear it up and throw it away 2 years later. So I think the point is to be much more nimble and watch the developments in the sector on the one hand, and in the short term. So right now we know that solar prices and wind prices are at a good place and likely to fall. We hope that battery prices will fall. So perhaps a bold way to go, at least for some states, even if not all of the country yet, is to say that, okay, we are not going to add any new coal capacity. I think even an announcement like that, I think is a big step forward for a country like India. We haven't got that yet. So a formal accounting of a statement on that kind, and of course, adopting this whole the acknowledging the fact that this transition is not just about the energy sector, it's about the economy, it's about society, it's a much larger, wider transition, and therefore coming up with imaginative processes and systems by which one can negotiate this transition. I think that's again something, because as your model itself points out, it has so many implications, whether it's on finance, whether it's on jobs, whether it's on water, whether it's on air. How do we deal with all this? I don't think we have anywhere near the institutional structures or systems to deal with it. So I think that would be an interesting thing. And very quickly to answer the question of whether cost optimization is the way to go, I'm not sure it needs to be the way to go, as long as we can build a convincing narrative that not everything necessarily can be monetized. There are things that one can gain which are not necessarily monetizable, but leads to quality of life, leads to better employment. To some extent, maybe it can be translated into numbers, but not everything needs to be translated to numbers if we can build a convincing enough narrative around it. How to do that, I don't know, but we'll have to work on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashok. And you did give us a big policy lever, which is announcing no new coal. So thanks for that. Amrit, if you could go to you next, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Now, I really like the discussion, but sorry, if you could repeat the question that I need to answer.
Right. So just by way of closing remarks, what do you think are the most powerful policy levers, and whether you have any thoughts about shifting the narrative from one which focuses overly on costs to one that possibly looks forward at opportunities? And I think your sector is something that is very ideally.
Yes, in hydrogen, you can't avoid not having a discussion on costs. And honestly, it's not a discussion about, so that is the one big piece that we are trying to grapple with, but it needs to be answered at an institutional level, not in terms of final cost to industry or customers in 2030, but how do we drive the supply chain costs down, because that is what is going to drive down everything else. So ours is more about ecosystem development and supply chain development. It's not this is not unique to India. The cost of electrolyzers, the high capital cost is really the big hurdle. So you've seen the numbers. There are very, very ambitious projections of the build out for electrolyzers, which will drive costs down from currently, 800 USD to possibly a lot less in the 200 to 300 USD levels. So the discussion is probably less on pricing of hydrogen, because we are trying to be at par with fossil fuels by 2030. So if it is not $2, if it is, the aim is to go below $2, then how do we achieve that? So the focus is on economics, yes, but on the supply chain economics rather than on policy measures to bring that cost down.
Thank you. So the first panelist spoke about a government policy announcement, and you spoken more about the market forces and the cost reduction as we scale up. Dr. Rao, we'll turn to you now. Thanks.
I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer your question, since it's a little too technical for my sensibilities. But let me put out a wish list. Let me put out a dream, which has got nothing to do with a policy instrument, which is, can we use the transition that not just India is going to go through, but the globe is going to go through, to create opportunities for comparative advantage development in India, where India starts providing tech to the world on climate change. At least, if not to Europe, there is a wide part of the world like Africa, where you can create a market for your services. The objective being that if we are only doing incremental stuff, then there is nowhere that we are going to create the employment that our booming young generation needs. So can we tie these two broad needs of the country, climate change on the one side and employment generation on the other side, together to create an interesting opportunity? I'm not sure we can answer that question, but that's something that would be very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll all share that dream, that wish list. But Sabina, you have the last word. Please.
Great. Thank you so much, Ulka. So you asked a kind of two-part question. One is, should we move from a narrative of cost to a narrative of opportunity? And I think what is driving a lot of action on the climate side is this idea that it is an opportunity. So I think, and an economic opportunity. So I think that is well recognized. Where I think we don't talk enough and deeply enough about the cost narrative is when it comes to things like jobs, because again, the discourse is very limited to how many jobs are lost, how many are gained. But the discourse around employment, around livelihoods goes way deeper than that, right? As by way of last word to your point about what would be the one top thing on my wish list, with respect to this particular issue, the government spent roughly, between central and state, spent roughly 10 lakh crores on over 600 social protection schemes last year. I would love to see us streamline our labor protections, our social protections, our social security schemes, see them streamlined and move toward a universal system that would then create a foundation and a pathway for us to actually pursue these important transitions that we need to pursue as an economy, at the same time that our people are well protected and we can harness their productive potential. So I'll stop there. You're on mute, Ulka.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich discussion, and we've ended up with a wish list involving technology, policy, welfare, and really hopefully climate change gives us just that kind of inflection point by which to rethink, reflect upon the way things are going, and see if we can introduce elements that improve and indeed transform our economy. So I'd like to end with a note of thanks to all our participants, but especially to you, the panelists. Many of you have reviewed the paper in earlier stages and provided valuable inputs, and indeed have been guiding our research team. So thanks to Deepthi, Varun, and other members of our research team and our funders. Thank you very much once again, all of you, for joining us. We hope that you'll explore the model and give us your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.